And thanks for joining me, everyone. Charles Moscowitz here. Welcome to the program. And let's just see. My guest is John Perazzo. John is an author. He's written his latest book is The New Shame of the Cities. He's written an article on the front page magazine, Black Lives Matter, Marxist Hate, dressed up as racial justice. I think, John, it's safe to say that by any observation, Black Lives Matter looks to me to be a group that's predominantly white suburban types. We don't know where they, get their money. That's for sure. Although you've got some great information about that. But their politics is outright Marxist, and they're agitating revolution. They don't go. Then they go back a few years. Give us a little background on how they got started and who they are.
Sure. They got started in the year 2013. This was right after the acquittal of a man named George Zimmerman, who you may recall was the individual who shot and killed Trayvon Martin in 2012. And after that, three young Black women got together. They happened to be Marxist revolutionary women. They got together and they formed Black Lives Matter as a way, ostensibly, to address the notion that America was filled with systemic racism of the type that led to the death of Trayvon Martin, and more to the point that police officers across the country are infested with this same type of racism. So that's when it started in 2013. It didn't really kick into high gear until the next year, after the death of Michael Brown, you may recall, in Ferguson, where there were many riots, lots of violence after that shooting. And that's what really put Black Lives Matter on the map.
Now, I think it seems like some of the same characters involved go actually way back. Like, for example, Susan Rosenberg was part of the Weather Underground. She had been convicted of bombing the Pentagon. Then she was pardoned, I believe, by Obama, or it might have been Clinton. And she's one of the major, administrators, organizers behind Black Lives Matter. It also has some of the same resurrection of the anti-Iraq war movement, the International Answer movement,
Yeah.
the Ruckus Society of the 1980s. These are the same old motley Marxists who have agitated under various guises and under various excuses, going way back. And I think that from what I understand, Soros has his fingerprints all over this thing. Money has gone into it from him. And what I find particularly troublesome about this is that after the Floyd incident, they then started to get money from municipalities around the country, and they started getting private citizens started raising money. I mean, I actually have a young relative who went out and started to sell cookies in order to raise money for Black Lives Matter. They don't have any idea what Black Lives Matter actually is and what the background is. But I wouldn't mind finding out as a citizen, as a taxpayer, exactly what it is that they're doing with who knows how much money, probably hundreds of millions of dollars.
It is hundreds of millions of dollars. And you're right, the young person that you described undoubtedly feels very good about himself, feels like he's doing something good for society, good for racial justice, etc. And that's an outgrowth of the fact that when Black Lives Matter started 7 years ago, they chose their name very deliberately to be a slogan that no one could really take issue with. Black Lives Matter, there's no one that would dispute that. It's actually a very good and respectable slogan. And so what they did is they used that slogan as a cover to mask an agenda that is truly Marxist, truly an agenda that aims to transform the US into a socialist nation. That's what it's about. And when you think about Marxism and all that it entails, there is absolutely nothing that an organization could get behind that would be more destructive to Black America than Marxism. And yet here we are, a Marxist organization claiming to be fighting for the rights and the justice and the respect of Black Americans. It's absolutely incredible.
You know, the title Black Lives Matter, it kind of reminds me of the going back to the 1930s, the sort of these fellow traveling organizations. A reporter by the name of J.B. Matthews wrote extensively about this. He had been a former communist, and that they take on these names like anti-fascist, so and so, the Organization for Motherhood and Apple Pie. I mean, you know what I mean? It's like they'll affix these titles onto their group, and it's all euphemisms. I mean, it makes it very difficult. Oh, I'm against motherhood. It's like
Yeah.
you don't want to appear against this. And so now they went out shortly after the George Floyd incident, where they ostensibly would go out into predominantly black neighborhoods where they would loot black businesses, burn down black homes and communities, kill black people by driving the police out of the neighborhood. That they would then go up to major political figures, including Vice President Pence, and they would demand that they take a loyalty oath to this group. Do you think Black Lives Matter? They would have to get them to say the words Black Lives Matter. And if they didn't say the words Black Lives Matter, then I suppose that would mean that they were against this organization murdering black people around the country and looting black businesses and burning black homes, which is what they've done after the George Floyd attack. And it's a very bizarre juxtaposition of factors going on here. And yet, in my own community of Boston, I see predominantly white clapboard, you know, Protestant churches with these gigantic banners saying Black Lives Matter.
Yes. And what's remarkable about that, by the way, what you just mentioned, when they say Black Lives Matter, and then if they won't, they say what you don't think about Black Lives Matter. That's
Right.
exactly the anticipation of that type of an event is exactly what went in.
Mm-hmm.
Knew that they could use that as a way to intimidate people into saying the phrase, and by saying the phrase, then supposedly endorsing the entire agenda. You mentioned about the churches that embrace Black Lives Matter and very proudly put signs out on their front lawns talking about their respect for Black lives and et cetera. And what you've got to realize is that Black Lives Matter, one of the most remarkable facets of their ideology is their rejection of the nuclear family. Now, this is something that's right in their literature. It's undeniable. They've been very clear about it. Now, you would think that a church which would promote Judeo-Christian values, of which the traditional nuclear family is first and foremost, you've got a situation where the nuclear family, you've got a Black community in America where 70% of babies born today are born out of wedlock. And they're born into homes where there's no father. And there's absolutely nothing in the world that you could do to make life more difficult for a young person, regardless of race, than to bring them into the world in a home where there's no father. They're much more likely to end up in poverty, to have all types of abuse and neglect and emotional troubles, to end up continuing the cycle of out of wedlock births down the road, to end up in the criminal justice system, juvenile reform homes, long-term prison inmates, you name it. And here you've got an organization claiming Black Lives Matter, and they are promoting the notion that the nuclear family should be done away with and replaced by what they call villages, which would be a socialist alternative to families. And why do they do this? Because Marx and Engels wrote about this, and they said the dissolution of private property will lead inevitably to the dissolution of the family. That's the way history should progress. So they're claiming to care about Black lives, but they don't. They care about Marxism, period.
Well, I mean, the nuclear family is one of the most, it's a bulwark of freedom. I mean, it's proven over millennia, going back in every society, in the world, historically and today, over time, to be the most sovereign of units. In other words, the most self-sufficient, most independent of organizations, the most basic, which is why they despise it. And that, yeah, they destroyed, and meanwhile, you had the left back in the 1960s destroying the Black family which had actually been very intact up until that point. I mean, it was none other than President Lyndon Johnson's Assistant Secretary of Labor, Daniel Patrick Moynihan, who was a sociologist who wrote a report about this, who pointed out that the increase of national welfare programs would disintegrate the black family. And he was absolutely right. You had incentives to have the husband leave or to not get married. And then you had further incentives for having more children out of wedlock. And I'm not blaming black people for that. I'm blaming the government for knocking in the door and saying, come on out, we got money here for you. You're giving them, you're corrupting people. And so, yeah, they were deliberately responsible for destroying, to a very large extent, what had been the intact black family and creating a lot of the social ills that resulted from that. They also destroyed or damaged the black church. They damaged black education by herding children into these rotten inner city schools, public schools, where they don't let them out. And now President Obama wants to offer school choice and tax credits for children to go to charter schools and private schools, and they're against that. And they're anti-business. They won't let people get into business and start to build an income and get a job. So in a sense, all of the social ills that have resulted in the black community in particular, from the leftist programs, the final defense is the police. They're the lost people who are going out there and trying to help black people, the 95% of whom are trying to get to work on time, trying to get on with their lives. They want their children to go out and be able to play in the schoolyard without being shot. And so now they want them to withdraw. They're the lost, in a sense, bastion before this communistic revolution that you referred to, where you have collectivism and you have an end of, ultimately, the individual identity itself.
Yes. Black Lives Matter portrays the police as a bunch of trigger-happy bigots who are ever ready to shoot and use excessive force against African Americans. The truth is exactly the opposite. We've got plenty of data to support it, and I think a couple of interesting data points. Number one, there is not a year that goes by where the number of police shootings of criminal suspects, of white criminal suspects, does not far exceed the number of police shootings of black criminal suspects. It's usually in the neighborhood of a 2-to-1 ratio. Exactly the opposite of the way Black Lives Matter portrays it. But Black Lives Matter doesn't care about that. And there's also a very interesting fact. If you look at criminal justice statistics, black Americans each year are responsible for approximately 37 to 39% of the most violent felonies. And these are the types of crimes that tend to be the crimes that cause situations to escalate with police, where it's possible, it's likelier that a police officer will have to use force, will have to use a weapon in order to deal with the situation. So in a criminal justice system where you had no racism, it was devoid of racism, you would expect about 37 to 39% of the suspects who were shot to be black, but it's not the case. The actual figure is somewhere between 25 and 30%. This is fascinating because it's exactly the opposite of what Black Lives Matter would have us believe. And it actually points toward a great deal of restraint and judiciousness on the part of police officers before they pull the trigger when dealing with African-American suspects. Exactly the opposite of what we're told.
Oh yeah, I mean, I think that's absolutely true. I mean, these are very professional people. I mean, it's not that there aren't occasionally bad ones out there, and yeah, I would think that a black man is more likely to be pulled over in a car, and maybe there is some racial profiling. I get that. There's a higher crime rate among black people, just like in the 1920s, if you were Italian in the south side of Chicago, you'd be more likely to be pulled over. There's just, ethnic groups have at various times higher crime propensities. But the idea that somebody would be, murdered or abused, it's something that's extremely rare, and it seems to me to be the kind of thing that is being used as a political football. Now, as you mentioned, John, the whole thing got started with Trayvon Martin, and the one thing I learned from that case, and not that I didn't know it already, but it kind of confirmed, is that you have to be very careful when something like this is portrayed, because the truth is not always what actually happened. You have to wait and step back and calmly wait for the facts to come out. That's kind of the traditional American model, which is that we want to have, we don't want to render a guilty verdict, until we have evidence. You're innocent until proven guilty. And we then find out that the Trayvon Martin thing was not accurately portrayed. There was a political agenda there. They doctored the tapes. CNN doctored the tapes that Zimmerman made. Zimmerman was not white. Trayvon Martin, they went out with a picture of him looking like a fresh-faced young 14-year-old, when in fact that was not what he looked like at the time, and that he was on private property, and that there was a scuffle and a fight, and we don't know whether or not Zimmerman pulled the trigger or it went off accidentally. I don't think, I mean, it looks like it was an equal fight, however, between these two men. So it had very little to do with race, and that it was ramped up as being an example of white people going out and just gunning down some young black guy. And I think it was political at the time because it was a way to defeat Mitt Romney in 2012, by subliminally mentioning, oh, those right-wing white people, I mean, we can't support them. And then, of course, this morphed into the Ferguson situation, where, again, not accurately portrayed in the media. He never shot that man in the back. There was not this "don't shoot" thing. That was a complete lie. So, this whole thing has a political agenda. I think there are things coming out about the George Floyd thing too, even though that was excessive, that he actually was suffocating before they even got to the car. He was having trouble breathing because he was apparently had an enormous amount of drugs in his system. So, and he was a career criminal. This case in Kenosha, the guy was they were going in to pick him up because he was charged with rape, because this woman had a restraining order against him and he had invaded her home. He was dangerous. It had nothing to do with race. I mean,
Yeah,
this
and
whole, yeah.
sometimes, very often in these cases, by the time the facts begin to filter out, the lie has had so much time to embed itself in the minds of the public that it's almost impossible to undo the narrative. It's not uncommon even today at Black Lives Matter protests to hear the phrase "hands up, don't shoot," which was attributed
Complete lie.
yeah, it was
Absolute false.
attributed to Michael Brown as if he was in the process of trying to surrender peacefully to the officer who shot him. They still say "hands up, don't shoot" at Black Lives Matter rallies, even though it's been shown to be a lie by not only a grand jury, but by the Obama Justice Department itself. So
Exactly.
these lies persist for a long.
Well, the reason they persist is they know they have a lot of stooges in the media who are going to perpetrate that. I mean, this is how they got away with the Russia hoax for so long. I mean, they know they have a friendly media who's going to back them up and support them, full court press. That's what's happened here. So, that's. I mean, it goes back to, I think, the Martin thing, but it's continued and it's gotten so bad under Trump that now people are actually feeling like, they've been successful at dividing people based on race, and they've convinced enough people that race relations are the worst ever, when in fact the opposite's the truth. I'm old enough to remember when race relations were pretty bad back in the 60s and 70s. You don't have that now. That's not what's going on in this country. I live in Boston. Today in Boston, I see young black men walking down the street, listening to their headphones. They're not afraid. You would never have seen that when I was growing up. Our society generally is more racially tolerant now. This is a great time to be black in America, especially if you want to get into business or you want to succeed. And yet you have people walking around who are just drinking this Kool-Aid that somehow, there's more oppression and there's more, racial division. And this is, the negativity of that. I mean, it's being used, and they always meant to use it as a cudgel against Trump and against conservatives, like they do every 4 years. But now it's really reached a fever pitch to the point where you have communist revolutions threatening cities.
Yes, and you see it even in the popular culture. That's one of the most disturbing aspects of the summer of 2020. I think is what we've seen say Hollywood and the celebrities there are very, very much on board with this notion that America is systemically racist. They like to see themselves quoted saying things like that, being on board with quote unquote revolution. We see it in the world of sports. You cannot watch a sporting event anymore without being bombarded with an in-your-face stream of propaganda, where the players not only the players themselves will wear the names of in the National Football League. They're wearing the names of people who were shot and killed by police officers on the backs of their jerseys. In the NBA, they're wearing what they call social justice slogans, where they might say Black Lives Matter or I Can't Breathe or various things like that. Say their names, enough, how many more, things like that, to give the impression that this is of such epidemic proportions. And same with baseball, they've adorned their fields with things like Black Lives Matter or United for Change. It's absolutely incredible. And there's hardly anyone in these professional leagues who has the courage actually to stand up and take a different position. In some cases, when they do, like we saw with Drew Brees, they back away very meekly afterwards because they're frightened into it.
Yeah, you can lose your job. You can lose your career. People, you take the path of least resistance, especially if you're in college. You don't want to, I mean, at Tufts University, for example, when I was doing a broadcast there, they had an anti-bias police officer on campus, and you could report to them if you heard anyone say something that could be defined as biased. And the result would be you could be called in and you could be expelled from school, or you could have your parents called. You could have a black mark on your record that could follow you the rest of your life. Nobody wants to have that, so you keep your head low. You just get on with your business and you internalize it, or you kind of become a part of it because it's the path of least resistance. This is how the Chinese system works. This is what communism does. This is what Nazism did.
Yes.
You can't speak too loudly because if you're viewed as an enemy of the state, you can lose all of the benefits that the state has granted you, because in those societies, the government grants rights. You don't have natural rights, which is the American idea.
This is what we've come to call in this country the cancel culture. You
Yeah.
see it all the time. And even just go back a few weeks, couple of months, we saw the opinion page editor at the New York Times was forced to resign, forced by dissent among his staff, simply because he ran an op-ed by Senator Tom Cotton calling for the use of the military in cases where Black Lives Matter protests and riots were getting out of hand. We saw the executive editor of the Philadelphia Inquirer undergo something similar, where he ran an article saying, it was headlined, "Buildings Matter Too." And what he meant by that is that it was kind of a response to the destruction and the catastrophe that his city had undergone as a result of Black Lives Matter riots that had demolished a number of buildings. And he was forced to resign because he had the temerity to run an article with that title. It was
it's getting really ugly out there. I mean, it was a while ago now. I think it was maybe the first year of the Trump administration. I heard Michael Smerconish, who was a big talk show host in Philadelphia, kind of left of center, but a very fair, moderate guy who tends to have people on from all sides. The old type of talk show host. He made a mild and moderate comment that praised President Trump for some specific thing that he had done. Not even a big deal. It was kind of like a toss away comment. And the level of hate mail that he got and the threats to boycott his sponsors, and he had these sponsors relationships for probably 30 years. All of a sudden they're getting calls, to drop him, and the death threats probably. I mean, he had to back down. He had to take it back. I mean, it's that ugly out there. It's that hateful. And this is classically what, it's everything this country is against. I mean, it's what liberals and conservatives should agree is not the way to go. I mean, we should have reasoned debate, and the individual has a right to their opinions. I mean, this is like.
Yeah, I'm sorry.
No, please go ahead. I know I'm ranting, but
No, no, I distinguish uh, very, very distinctly between liberals and leftists. A liberal would agree with what we're saying, but a leftist would not. A liberal agrees in the free and open exchange of ideas. Leftists do not. Leftists are, in fact, the embodiments of the fascists that they claim conservatives are. They do not tolerate dissenting viewpoints. And we see this in Black Lives Matter. We see it in droves. We see, for example, one of the heroes, one of the individuals whose philosophy Black Lives Matter embraces very, very enthusiastically is that of a man named Saul Alinsky. Your audience may be familiar with him.
right, Rules for Radicals.
Yes, he's been dead for almost a half a century, but he continues to have an enormous influence on the left. He was an enormous influence on Obama and on Hillary Clinton. And he talks about the importance of, the word he used was eternal warfare. He said, you never stop engaging in warfare against your enemy. No matter what, you never give any indication that you're interested in reconciliation, in free and open exchange of ideas, in meeting in the middle. You fight until your enemy is vanquished, and you do whatever you need to do, including lie as much as you need to lie. And we see that with Black Lives Matter. It's an eternal war. They can never be appeased, and they will lie about everything, including what we were talking about a moment ago, which is, for example,
Right.
police shootings.
And they have people who kind of go along with it because they either have drunk the Kool-Aid or because they just don't want to think for themselves anymore. And excuse me, you got some very allegedly respectable people that are involved in this. I mean, I get regular tweets from Professor Lawrence Tribe of Harvard, who was considered for the Supreme Court at one point, I think under Obama. And he puts on this tin hat and he starts running with these conspiracy theories about Trump. And now his latest is because Trump said in an interview with Bob Woodward that he thought that he didn't want the country to panic in the early stages of the pandemic. He's responsible for murdering, 100,000 people, and he's blood on his hands. I mean, it's become completely unglued. I mean, this is supposedly one of the best and the brightest who is engaging in this kind of really demented rhetoric. I don't know if he's losing his mind. He's probably up in years. I don't know. But it's sickening to see that. And it's completely discrediting Harvard. I mean, because he represents Harvard. But that's what I see out there. It's horrible.
Yeah, the left has taken on a position where they will push a narrative until the end of time. It doesn't matter what facts you confront them with. And again, this was something that Alinsky talked about. He said that you wage this war, you do not respond to facts, because he said if you do, if instead of casting your enemy as what he called a 100% devil, that was the terminology that he used. He said if you get away from that and you start to engage and talk about reason and facts and figures and statistics, what you're doing is you're watering down your position, and you're actually committing an act of what he called political idiocy. He said you don't want to do that. So if you need to lie, if you need to turn a blind eye to the fact that police shootings of African Americans are not out of proportion and are not unjustified in the vast majority of cases, you do lie.
In very, very few cases where it's justified. I mean, the FBI keeps the statistic. It's not, this is a huge lie. So my guest is John Perazzo, David Horowitz Freedom Center, FrontPage Magazine. He's got an article up there, Black Lives Matter, Marxist Hate dressed up as racial justice. John, I think that as we move toward the final date before the election, I would imagine that things are going to get uglier and more hateful than we can even imagine. Who knows what they're going to throw up next? But certainly part of that mix is going to be this ongoing looting of black businesses, burning of black homes, and killing of black people, because somehow, for some bizarre reason, they think that's going to help them, and that, of course, you've got all the mainstream left media ignoring it and hiding it. They won't show pictures, for example, of what the federal courthouse in Portland, Oregon looks like right now because it's ugly. They don't want the country to see that. What do you predict, John, over the next weeks as we go to the election? What else are they going to do? I mean, what else can they pull out? I don't know.
They've got surprises already planned out for sure.
It's going to be the outrage of the day, right?
Yes, they're certainly they're already in queue, ready to go. But I would absolutely predict a continuation of this fever pitch outrage that we're seeing, and I think what I expect to happen eventually is that, much like we saw in the '60s with the New Left, which was an in-your-face revolutionary movement, that eventually, by the beginning of the '70s, had really spent its capital, its political capital, and they had alienated so many Americans, including many who were previously sympathetic. I expect something like that to happen here, because there's only so far this can go. People don't want to live in cities. Well, even if they're Democratic voters, they don't want to live in cities where they're hostages.
Oh, they're leaving in droves. New York, I don't think is that. I mean, former governor, the Republican governor's name is Pataki. He said, "Look, I've been a New Yorker all my life, and I think I'm worried about the future of New York City. I mean, it's just it's a shell. People are leaving. People are leaving California. I just hope it happens sooner than later. I mean, in time anyway, because I think you're right. They're going to piss off so many people that it'll be like the fall of the left in the 1960s, which resulted in, a more conservative country for many decades. Even when Bill Clinton came up, he was more conservative than previous leftists. So, I hope that happens. And then I hope once it happens, if it does, God willing, the Democratic Party is going to purge these people and go back to what it is, or else they're going to go for extinction. But we'll see.
I would hope that one of those two things would happen, that they would either change their course or become extinct, because the way they've evolved to this point is a disaster for this country. And many lifelong Democrats really don't understand that the Democratic Party of today bears hardly any resemblance to the Democratic Party of 2 decades ago.
Oh, absolutely not. It's not the Democratic Party of John F. Kennedy, that's for sure.
Kennedy would have no place in it.
Right. That's right. All right, John Perazzo, listen, I want to thank you for joining me this afternoon. Very interesting talk. Let's do it again soon. And thanks a lot, sir.
Thank you. It was my pleasure.
All right.